presented to you by Mr. DarXnights. Tonight, let me take you back to a quiet town where secrets had sharp edges, and letters carried more than just ink. They carried fear. This is not a legend. This is not fiction. This is the unsolved nightmare of Circleville, Ohio. Nobody noticed the first letter at first. Just a plain white envelope. No return address. The name written in heavy block letters across the front. The kind of thing you might toss aside with junk mail or credit card offers. But this wasn't junk. And whoever sent it knew everything. It started in 1976. Circleville, Ohio, a town so ordinary it barely registered on a map. Streets lined with modest homes. Cornfields stretching for miles, and a population that left its doors unlocked and kids outside past sunset. A place where everyone knew everyone, and trouble rarely stuck around. Then the letters came, handwritten in jagged block print. The tone was accusatory and cruel. Personal details were revealed, things that no one outside the household should have known. The first target was Mary Gillespie, a local school bus driver. The letter accused her of having an affair with the school superintendent, Gordon Massey. It was unsigned, just a warning. "I know what you did," it said. "Stay away from him. I'm watching." Mary tried to ignore it. Maybe a prank, she thought, a disgruntled parent, or someone with too much time on their hands. But the letters didn't stop. They multiplied. They got nastier. And then they started targeting her husband, Ron Gillespie. Ron received his own letter shortly after. The message was even darker, threatening violence if Mary didn't end the alleged affair. Still, the Gillespies said nothing publicly. They told no one. But someone already knew they were keeping quiet. The stalker seemed to be inside their lives. Then, the phone call started. At first, just silence on the other end. Then a low, raspy voice, sometimes whispering, sometimes laughing. Still, no one wanted to make it public. Circleville was small-town America. A scandal like this could destroy reputations. So the family held their breath and hoped the storm would pass. It didn't. Weeks later, signs began appearing along Mary's school bus route. Large hand-painted boards nailed to fence posts or hung from trees, accusing her, shaming her, using her full name. Whoever was doing this wanted the town to turn against her. Mary started pulling over to take them down, one by one. She began carrying a wrench in the bus to rip them off their posts. And yet the messages kept coming. Then came August 19th, 1977. That day, Ron received a phone call. No one knows exactly what was said, but moments later, he picked up his gun, told his children he was going out to confront the person behind the letters, and drove off in his pickup truck. He never came home. Later that evening, his truck was found crashed into a tree just outside of town. Ron was dead. At first glance, it seemed like a tragic accident, but the sheriff noticed something strange. Ron had fired his gun once. There were no shell casings in the truck, no sign of who or what he might have shot at. Even stranger, his blood alcohol level was reported to be at 0.16, twice the legal limit. But his family swore Ron didn't drink. Not that night, not ever. They were convinced someone had tampered with the evidence. And still, the letters continued. Whoever the smiling stalker was, Ron's death had not stopped them. If anything, it emboldened them. They wrote letters to local officials, law enforcement, and residents across Pickaway County, each one the same scrawl, each one filled with venom. No one was safe. Then came another twist. Mary, trying to live her life in the shadow of her husband's death, started noticing someone had tampered with her school bus tires. Then she saw another sign on her route, another accusation. But this one was nailed to a wooden box rigged with twine. When she pulled it down, she discovered a crude booby trap. Inside the box was a small pistol, rigged to fire if someone tried to remove the sign. She was lucky. The trap misfired. Police examined the device and traced the serial number on the gun. That's when the story exploded. The gun belonged to Paul Freshour, Mary's brother-in-law. Paul was Ron's brother, The same Ron who died under mysterious circumstances. He had been vocal about wanting to find the letter writer. At one point, Paul even suggested he and other family members try writing their own fake letters to see if they could trick the stalker into revealing themselves. Now the tables had turned. All eyes were on him. Paul denied everything, said the gun had been stolen, that he had nothing to do with the booby trap, the letters, or the campaign of fear that had taken over Circleville. But police weren't convinced. They searched his house. No physical evidence linked him to the device. The letters, however, kept coming, even while Paul was being interrogated. Still, he was arrested. In 1983, Paul went to trial, not for the letters, but for the attempted murder of Mary Gillespie with the booby trap. Despite weak evidence and the fact that handwriting experts couldn't definitively link him to the letters, Paul was convicted and sentenced to 7 to 25 years in prison. You'd think the story ends there. It didn't, because the letters kept coming. Even while Paul was behind bars in maximum security, with no access to pen, paper, or the outside world, letters bearing the same handwriting continued to arrive at homes, businesses, and newsrooms around Ohio. One even went to the Attorney General's office. Paul pleaded with officials. He said he was being framed, that someone had orchestrated everything, from Ron's death to the booby trap, to make him look guilty. And more disturbingly, he might have been right. A journalist from Columbus who began investigating the case received their own letter. In the same unmistakable blocky handwriting, it read, "If you come to Circleville, you'll find out what we did to Ron." Even after Paul was released from prison in 1994, the letters didn't stop immediately. They slowed, then vanished, just as mysteriously as they began. No one has ever been caught. No one confessed. No one knows the truth. But one thing remains: the fear, the sense that someone somewhere knew too much. And whoever they were smiling. They locked the man away, said justice had been served. But the letters didn't stop. The eyes in the dark kept watching. The town of Circleville still wasn't safe. And the smiling stalker was still out there, writing. The prison bars couldn't stop the letters. After Paul Freshour was convicted in 1983 and sentenced for the attempted murder of Mary Gillespie, most believed the nightmare was finally over. But they were wrong. Freshour had been held in solitary confinement at one point. No access to writing materials, no visitors, no way to send or receive mail. And yet, the same chilling letters began arriving at mailboxes around Ohio once again. And this time they grew bolder. They weren't just accusations now. They were warnings, direct threats, challenges to law enforcement and the media. One letter sent to a television station read, "Forget Circleville, Ohio. Do nothing to hurt Sheriff Radcliffe. If you come to Ohio, you El Sickos will pay." Another one arrived for Paul himself. "Now, when are you going to believe you aren't getting out of there? I told you 2 years ago. When we set them up, they stay set up. Don't you listen at all?" He read those words in a cell. Alone, powerless. It was clear. If Paul was a writer, then he had help on the outside. Someone committed enough to continue the psychological warfare. But if he wasn't the writer, then the real stalker was still free, still angry, still writing. Journalists began digging deeper. One of them, Martin Yant, grew obsessed with the contradictions in the case. He discovered that during the time the booby trap was found, the one that allegedly led to Paul's conviction, another potential suspect had been seen near the site. A man who'd harbored resentment toward Mary and had access to the same kind of weapon. But the sheriff's department never followed up. Yet also found inconsistencies in the timelines. Phone records, alibis, and even Paul's alleged confession were flimsy. In fact, Paul never truly confessed anything. His own voice, captured on tape, expressed confusion and frustration. He insisted he'd been set up, and by now, the residents of Circleville had their doubts too. Whispers crept through the town like fog. Was Paul innocent all along? Had the true writer simply found the perfect scapegoat? Or was a rabbit hole deeper, involving more than just one person? Some even suggested the original letters were a group effort, multiple people, each with different grudges, hiding behind one shared persona. A smiling mask no one could remove. And the mask had a name, though the letters were unsigned. Some had a cryptic symbol at the bottom, a circle with two eyes, drawn to look like a crude human face. The mouth always turned up into a grin. Locals began calling the sender the smiling stalker. It wasn't long before the story took on a life of its own. The media caught wind of the mystery. Television crews descended on Circleville, asking questions the sheriff's office refused to answer. Even Unsolved Mysteries, the national TV program, aired an episode about the case in 1994. The show received thousands of calls from viewers with theories and potential leads. But right after the episode aired, another letter arrived. It read, "Forget Circleville. If you come back, you'll pay. The Circleville writer is watching." It was a message, a threat, a warning, and it worked. The media stopped digging. The camera crews packed up. Circleville faded from the headlines. And just like that, the trail went cold again. But for Mary Gillespie, the nightmare never ended. She had survived the loss of her husband, survived the letters, survived the booby trap, but she couldn't escape the whisper campaign. Some in town still believed she had lied, that the affair had been real, that Ron had died for nothing. Even her own children grew up in the shadow of doubt. Ron's death had never been properly investigated. No fingerprints were found. The bullet hole he supposedly fired had no matching trajectory. The alcohol level reported in his autopsy was inconsistent with his known behavior that night. And still, his death was labeled accidental. His brother Paul had been locked up. But if he wasn't guilty, then who was? That's when another theory emerged, one that chilled everyone who heard it. Some believed the sheriff himself had helped frame Paul. Sheriff Dwight Radcliffe had handled the case from the beginning. He was known in the community as a no-nonsense lawman, but he had also been the first on the scene the night Ron died. Some believe Ron had discovered something, maybe the identity of the letter writer, and was silenced. And maybe Paul had come too close to the truth. It would explain the rushed investigation, the incomplete evidence, the strange refusal to follow up on other suspects. But it would also mean that someone in power, someone sworn to protect, had been part of the very thing tearing the town apart. And that's what made Circleville different. This wasn't just a case of anonymous threats or small town scandal. This was a deep rot, a sickness no one could name, a phantom no one could catch, and a smile that never faded. By the time Paul was released from prison in 1994, he was a broken man. He moved away from Circleville, hoping to rebuild a life somewhere without the weight of the past. But he couldn't forget. In interviews, he spoke with frustration and sadness, not about being in prison, but about how easily everyone had believed he was capable of such cruelty. He didn't want revenge. He wanted the truth. But the truth had long ago been buried beneath secrets, lies, and silence. Paul died in 2012, never knowing who had ruined his life. And still, the letters have never officially stopped. Every few years, another one appears. No return address, blocky handwriting, a message soaked in malice, and always the same eerie signature. A face, a circle, two eyes, and a smile. There's something particularly horrifying about a threat without a face. An enemy that's not flesh and blood, but ink and paper. Someone who knows you, but you can't know them. Someone who could be your neighbor, your coworker, your friend, even your family. And that was the real terror of the Circleville letters. It wasn't just about murder, or fear, or lies. It was about power. Whoever the smiling stalker was, they didn't want money, or fame, or forgiveness. They wanted control. And they got it. For decades, one person, or maybe many, manipulated a town like a marionette, tugging on strings, playing God, deciding who to accuse, who to threaten, who to destroy. And they almost got away with it. Almost. Because now the world remembers. Now the story is known. And now, so are the questions. Who killed Ron Gillespie? Who built the booby trap? Who knew everyone's secrets? And why did the sheriff never dig deeper? Somewhere in Circleville, the answers may still exist, buried in an attic, hidden in a box, written in a forgotten letter, or perhaps watching from behind a curtain, waiting, smiling, because stories like this don't really end. They just go quiet until the next envelope arrives. We've come to the final chapter, but there's no resolution, no justice, only fear and the quiet echo of a typewriter clacking in the dark. The smiling stalker was never caught, and the people of Circleville never slept easy again. Years passed, the world moved on, but Circleville didn't forget. People locked their doors earlier, glanced over their shoulders more often, checked the mailbox with a mix of dread and curiosity, always wondering if that thick white envelope would appear again, addressed in blocky, precise letters. No return name, no stamp trail, only fear sealed inside. By the late 1990s, the original families had scattered. Mary Gillespie retired and withdrew from the public eye. She never gave a full interview again. Her children, now adults, refused to speak about the past, not because they didn't remember, but because they remembered too well. Ron Gillespie's death still hung over them like fog over the cornfields. He had been a quiet, hard-working man, a school bus driver, a father. He deserved answers. But all he got was a tombstone and an official label that made no sense. Accidental death. Even though a bullet had fired inside his truck. Even though tire tracks showed he'd veered off like he'd been forced off the road. No fingerprints. No ballistics. No justice. Just silence. Paul Freshour, after serving a decade in prison for a crime he insisted he didn't commit, returned to a quiet life far from Circleville. His interviews became increasingly rare, but in the few he did grant, he always said the same thing. I didn't write the letters. I never wrote them. Someone set me up. Someone knew everything. Someone wanted to destroy people, and they succeeded. When asked who that someone might be, he often paused, looked away, then answered, I think they were close, closer than anyone thought. And maybe he was right, because this case wasn't just about anonymous threats. It was about surveillance, about secrets, about betrayal that came from within the community. Some letters had included details only law enforcement should have known. Medical histories, job applications, private affairs, things that weren't public, things buried in sealed files. It made people wonder, was the stalker part of the sheriff's office? A clerk in the courthouse? A mail carrier? A teacher? A friend? Or was it more than one person? That theory gained traction among researchers and internet sleuths as the case became infamous online in the 2000s and 2010s. Blogs, forums, and YouTube channels began dissecting the mystery frame by frame, letter by letter. Some theorized that the original writer had died, but the role had been passed on, like a curse or a torch, a shared mask behind which multiple people could hide. And others pointed the sheriff again, Dwight Radcliffe. Sheriff Radcliffe had ruled the county with an iron grip for decades. He'd been there the night Ron died. He'd handled the evidence, conducted the interviews, chosen what was released and what was kept hidden. When he retired, more questions came to light. Some officers admitted off the record that evidence in the Circleville case had mysteriously vanished over time. Audio tapes, handwritten logs, even some of the letters themselves. Gone. Just gone. The perfect crime isn't one where no clues are left. It's one where the clues were never real to begin with. But what made the Circleville case so uniquely terrifying wasn't just a crime. It was the presence, The invisible hand that touched every life in town, that knew your name, your secrets, your habits, who you loved, who you lied to. It was a monster without a face, a ghost that didn't haunt houses, but paper and ink, and it was relentless. Even today, journalists still receive odd emails when researching the case. Some contain old photographs. Others include sentences from the original letters. There are even claims that the smiling stalker has resurfaced, this time targeting true crime investigators who dig too deep. In 2017, a YouTuber received a typed message in the mail. No name, no address, just one sentence. Stay away from Circleville. You were warned. They took down the video that night. Coincidence? Maybe. But those who know the story don't believe in coincidences anymore. Paul Freshour died in 2012. No confession, no closure, just an empty grave mark of a man who became a symbol of justice denied, of suspicion, of questions left unanswered. And as for Mary, she remains one of the most tragic figures in this tale. Targeted, haunted, forever accused. Whether her affair was real or fabricated, it no longer mattered. Her name became bound to the mystery, to the whispers, to the fear. She lost her husband, lost her privacy, nearly lost her life. And still, no one was punished. No one was caught, because the Circleville writer didn't just write letters. They wrote history, rewrote reputations, rewrote reality. And perhaps that's what makes this case different from any other true crime story. There was no blood trail, no confession caught on tape, no conclusive DNA, no single fingerprint to tie it all together. Just shadows, echoes, paper ghosts. But what if we've been looking at it all wrong? What if the real horror wasn't who the smiling stalker was, but how easy it was for them to destroy lives from behind a curtain of anonymity? What if the letters weren't about vengeance, but entertainment? Think about it. Whoever wrote them got to watch a town unravel from the inside. Marriages destroyed. Friendships broken. A man dead. Another imprisoned. All with a typewriter and a postage stamp. It wasn't justice. It was theater. And everyone in Circleville had a role to play. Even now, the case draws people in, obsessives, detectives, storytellers, trying to solve what might be unsolvable, trying to name a ghost that never left, and maybe never will, because every town has secrets, every family has skeletons, every person has something they hope no one ever finds out. The smiling stalker understood that. They didn't need a knife or a gun. They had something far more powerful, words. And words, once sent, can never be taken back. So maybe the reason we still talk about Circleville today isn't because we're close to solving it. Maybe it's because deep down, we fear we could be next. One envelope, one letter, one lie. That's all it takes. And when you hear your mailbox slam shut one quiet evening and see the white paper sticking out, just remember, it might be your turn now. Story 2. This is not a legend, not a ghost story. This is real. A monster walked among us, and he didn't hide in the shadows. He built his house of horror in plain sight, and inside that house was the toy box. Imagine waking up, not in your bed, not even in a room you recognize, but on a cold, hard table, your arms and legs strapped down, your mouth gagged, and the only sound in the room is a cassette player clicking on. Then a voice, calm, deliberate, chilling, speaks. Hello there, BTCH. You're probably wondering why you're here, but I'm going to tell you in detail, asterisk. That's how it began for the victims of David Parker Ray. They didn't wake up to a rescuer. They didn't wake up to light. They woke up in the toy box. Truth is, the story of David Parker Ray is so twisted, so vile, that even seasoned detectives hesitated to speak of it without flinching. What they found in that little trailer in New Mexico didn't belong in reality. It belonged in a horror film. But the devil doesn't need horns and fire. Sometimes he wears a mustache and drives a tow truck. David was born in 1939 in Belen, New Mexico. A lonely, awkward kid, raised mostly by his strict grandfather. His life was void of warmth or stability, but the seed of violence was planted early. His father, a violent drunk, would randomly show up and give him porn magazines, graphic, disturbing stuff. Stuff no child should have seen. That was the first poison in his mind. He grew up quiet, but his fantasies grew loud. By high school, classmates remember him as strange, withdrawn. Some said he talked about hurting women, about controlling them, but no one really believed him. Why would they? Small towns buried dark things easily. David joined the army, became a mechanic, seemed normal, but inside, the fantasies were maturing, becoming plans, blueprints. He didn't want to hurt women randomly. He wanted to do it in a system, a process, a performance. And so he built the toy box. It looked like an ordinary white trailer from the outside, parked near Elephant Butte Lake, just a few miles from Truth or Consequences, New Mexico. A strange name for a town, but strangely fitting. Inside the trailer, though, there were no toys, just tools, chains, whips, surgical instruments, syringes, pliers, saw blades, a wooden gynecological chair fitted with restraints, video cameras mounted in corners, a mirror fixed to the ceiling, soundproof walls. The whole place smelled of latex and old blood. And then there were the tapes. He called them orientation tapes. They were recordings of David's voice, calmly describing what he planned to do to his victim, what they could expect, how long they would be held, when, if ever, they might be released. He spoke with the monotony of a man giving instructions to an employee. If you're lucky, you'll be kept as a slave. If you're not, well, there are worse things than death. Those were his words. The horror wasn't just the torture. It was the psychology, the way he broke them down before he even touched them. Some victims would remain drugged for days, barely conscious. Others were kept fully awake, forced to witness the torment of others. He had accomplices. His girlfriend, Cindy Hendy, yes, girlfriend, helped lure victims. She wasn't innocent. She was all in, a partner in evil. Sometimes they used drugs like GHB or sodium pentothal to knock women out. Sometimes they pretended to be cops, pulling women over before abducting them. Once inside the toy box, the women vanished from the world. Some were never seen again, and others lived to tell the tale. In March 1999, everything unraveled. One woman, Cynthia Vigil, escaped. She had been chained for 3 days, drugged, assaulted, tortured. But somehow, when David left the keys unattended, she grabbed them. She unlocked her restraints. Naked, bleeding and in shock, she ran. Not down a hallway, not through a hidden passage. She ran through the New Mexico desert, barefoot, until she reached a mobile home. She banged on the door, begging for help, still dragging the metal chain from her ankle. The neighbor let her in, called the cops, and when the police arrived, they followed her story straight to David Parker Ray's trailer. What they found inside shocked even veteran officers. One officer said, it was like walking into hell. Everything was cataloged, organized, like a sadist museum. There were diagrams, hand-drawn illustrations of torture methods, books on brainwashing, surgical manuals, a mirror with the words, "You're being watched," scribbled in marker, and dozens of cassette tapes. Some of them recordings of David's own voice, others recordings of the victims. Detectives knew instantly this wasn't a one-time thing. This had been going on for years, maybe decades. But how many victims? No one knew. David kept trophies, jewelry, clothing, photographs. But there were no bodies, no graves, only the stories and the screams on tape. As the investigation deepened, Other women came forward. One said she remembered waking up in a strange room, cold, naked, a man telling her she had been chosen, but she didn't know if it was a dream. She thought maybe she'd been drugged at a bar, that her mind had played tricks on her. But after the arrest, she saw the toy box on the news, and the memories came flooding back. More victims stepped forward. More confirmed what the police feared. David Parker Ray had been doing this for years, with planning, with help, with zero remorse. But the justice system? It wasn't built to handle evil like this. They charged him, yes, with dozens of counts: kidnapping, rape, assault, torture. Cindy Hendy flipped immediately. She made a deal, testified against him in exchange for a lighter sentence. And David, he denied the worst of it, said it was all consensual, said the women knew what they were getting into, that it was just extreme role play. But the tapes, they said otherwise. The victims, they remembered. The trial dragged on. One victim recanted under pressure. Others were too traumatized to testify. The DA knew they had to secure something before the whole case collapsed. So, in a devastating twist of irony, they offered David a plea deal, and he took it. He was sentenced to 224 years in prison, but he never served them. David Parker Ray died of a heart attack in 2002, just 3 years into his sentence. In his cell, quietly, no punishment, no closure. He took his secrets with him. To this day, the FBI believes there are many more victims, some buried in the New Mexico desert, some never reported missing, others who might still be alive, too afraid to come forward. One agent said, "We'll never know the true body count. Never." And maybe that's the worst part. He got away with it for decades, living right among everyone else, smiling, friendly, fixing engines, dating women, all while his toy box waited. And when the trailer was finally dismantled, investigators said there were markings on the walls, tallies maybe, symbols, dates, but no one ever deciphered them. And somewhere out there, the tapes still exist. Evidence, but also curses, echoes of a man who believed he owned the women he took. And in his own words, he once said, "If I'm careful, and I can do this for years. And no one will ever know." He was right, until one victim ran, until the toy box opened. You can lock the doors, you can close the blinds, but some nightmares live in sunlight. Some monsters with the face of a man you trust to fix your car or date your daughter. David Parker Ray wasn't a shadow in the night. He was daylight evil. After Cynthia Vigil escaped and led authorities to the trailer in Elephant Butte, the floodgates opened. What detectives found wasn't just evidence of one crime. It was a time capsule of sadism, a personal gallery of suffering. As they pulled back the layers of David's twisted world, the case became darker than anyone had imagined. Inside that trailer, officers found a list, not a simple grocery-style checklist. No, this was a handwritten inventory. Dozens of names, partial descriptions, even notations like good body, uncooperative, kept 3 days. Some of the names were circled, some were crossed out, and none were known to local law enforcement. To the FBI, it meant one thing. There were more victims. A lot more. They called in forensic teams, behavior analysts, even anthropologists. The toy box was torn apart, piece by piece. Each item cataloged, tested, cleaned for traces of blood, hair, DNA. There were stains on the carpet, fibers in the restraints. One small fingernail embedded in a wooden restraint post. But no bodies. And without bodies, charges were hard to stick. Still, the prosecutors pressed on. They found another victim, Angelica Montano. She was a former acquaintance of Ray's. After Cynthia's escape made national news, Angelica came forward, shaking, barely able to speak. She said years earlier, David had offered her a ride. Friendly, charming, until everything went black. She woke up in the toy box. Same cold table, same restraints, same mirror above her, and the same voice. The tape, always the tape. David played it like a ritual. The tape would explain what was going to happen, how long it might last, what she needed to do to survive. Then the real nightmare would begin. She said she was tortured, sexually assaulted, drugged repeatedly. And then, after 3 days, he let her go. No ransom, no demands. He drove her to a remote area and dropped her off like trash. She reported it at the time, went to the police, but they didn't believe her. No proof, no evidence, just a traumatized woman with a broken story and no memory of exact dates. The case was shelved. Until now, investigators now realized this had been going on for decades. They began pouring through missing persons reports from the region, especially women last seen near Truth or Consequences or Elephant Butte. They found patterns. Women disappearing near truck stops, bars, gas stations. Hitchhikers, runaways, drug users, sex workers, women whose absence raised few alarms. But the biggest revelation came from a third survivor, Kelly Garrett. Kelly had gone missing in 1996. Her family assumed she'd vanished by choice. She had a troubled past, had struggled with addiction. They thought maybe she'd run off. But Kelly hadn't run. David and Cindy had lured her in, drugged her, and brought her to the trailer. She was kept for several days, subjected to torture, assault, and psychological manipulation. But Kelly didn't break. She pretended to be cooperative, obedient, and one night, David got careless. He left the key within reach. Just like Cynthia years later, Kelly managed to get loose. She ran barefoot and disoriented to the road. But unlike Cynthia, no one helped her. She made it to a bar, bruised and bleeding. Patrons assumed she was high or crazy. Police eventually brought her in, but again, no one believed her story. She was labeled unstable, delusional. She returned home silent, broken. Years passed. Then the news broke. The toy box killer, Elephant Butte, the trailer. Kelly's memories sharpened like glass. She came forward, and this time they believed her. Her testimony was key. With Kelly and Cynthia willing to testify, and with Cindy Henny's confession, the DA had a strong enough case to prosecute. But David wasn't going down easy. He pled not guilty to everything, claimed all the women were willing participants, that they were into BDSM and had consented to everything. The tapes, he said, were fantasy role play. The trailer, a private dungeon for consensual adults. And the victims, lying for attention. But the jury didn't buy it. They heard the tapes. And those tapes didn't sound like fantasy. They were confessions. They were cold, methodical instructions. Chilling, even to those hardened by years in court. One juror later said, "I couldn't sleep for days after hearing them." You don't fake that kind of evil. But there was a snag. In Cynthia's case, the key witness, the jury deadlocked. Hung trial. The prosecution was stunned. It felt like a nightmare. They had to retry the case. They did. But in the meantime, they struck a deal. They dropped some charges in exchange for a guilty plea. David Parker Ray was sentenced to over 2 centuries behind bars, but he didn't serve them. In 2002, just 3 years into his sentence, David dropped dead of a heart attack right before another trial was set to begin. Some say it was karma. Others say it was a final escape, a coward's exit. He died without ever truly confessing, without telling the truth about how many women died, where the bodies were, what the symbols on his trailer wall meant. But Cindy Hendy? She talked. A lot. She admitted that David murdered women, that he buried them in a nearby desert, that he dumped others in Elephant Butte Lake, weighed down with cinder blocks. She claimed she saw him kill at least 14 women, but no remains were ever found. FBI divers scoured the lake. Dogs searched the desert, but nothing. It was as if the desert itself swallowed the truth. Or maybe David was smart. He was, after all, very methodical. He used chemicals, burned evidence, moved quietly, targeted women whose disappearances wouldn't raise alarms. To this day, agents believe the toy box killer may have had more than 60 victims, possibly over 100. He kept no clear records, only hints, sketches, names, photos, unlabeled tapes. Hundreds of pieces of media were seized, most too graphic to ever be made public, and some are still unidentified. Unknown victims, unknown voices, unknown endings. Even now, law enforcement occasionally reopens a cold case in New Mexico and wonders, was this one of his? Did she die in the toy box? Did anyone hear her scream? Cindy Hendy served just 19 years. She was released in 2019. She walks free today. Free, while the voices on the tapes remain trapped. And as for the toy box itself, it was dismantled, torn apart for evidence. Some parts were burned, others stored away in federal evidence lockers. But pieces remain. The mirror, the chair, the diagrams, locked in a basement archive. Sometimes used for training new agents on what real evil looks like. And though David is gone, his legacy lingers. A warning that monsters don't always hide in the shadows. Sometimes they wave as they pass. Sometimes they smile. Sometimes they look like the mechanic fixing your engine. But inside, they build toy boxes. Tonight, we close the box. But some boxes don't lock forever. Some nightmares echo, even when the dreamer is long dead. Even after David Parker Ray died of a heart attack in 2002, the case didn't end, because death didn't clean the blood. It didn't erase the tapes. It didn't give back the missing daughters. It only stopped the man, not the horror. The FBI and New Mexico state authorities still had dozens of tapes, uncategorized, unlabeled, each one potentially holding answers, confessions, final moments, unnamed faces. But identifying the women proved harder than expected. Some tapes showed only legs. Some were filmed in darkness. Most had no audio names, no dates, just screams. And one chilling constant, the same cold voice, David Parker Ray narrating, explaining what he was doing. Like a teacher, like a craftsman, he described the anatomy, the tools, the timeline of his rituals. He documented it all. He didn't just enjoy the cruelty. He curated it, studied it, perfected it. For him, torture was an impulse. It was art. The FBI called in experts, voice analysts, trauma psychologists, even facial recognition specialists, to try and match the women in the videos to cold cases. Some matches were made, but most remain unknown. To this day, victims' families occasionally come forward with a blurry photo, a DNA sample, or a hope that their missing daughter, sister, wife might be identified in the toy box evidence. Sometimes they are. More often they aren't. And every time they press play on a new tape, someone hears the beginning. That sickening phrase David made each victim hear first. Hello there, BTCH. Are you comfortable right now? I doubt it. Wrists and ankles chained, gagged, probably blindfolded. You are disoriented and scared, too, I would imagine. Perfectly normal, under the circumstances. Asterisk. It wasn't a horror film. It was real. Those were the first words many women heard after waking up from drugged unconsciousness, naked bound, inside a 22-foot trailer in the desert. They were told exactly what would happen to them. And then it happened. Again and again. Investigators now believe the tapes were part of the ritual, a way for David to maintain control, to dehumanize, to break resistance before it began. Even worse, he showed them the toys, laid them out, explained each one, made the victims look, learn, fear. Then he would test them. He had a polygraph machine inside the trailer. He'd ask the women questions, about themselves, their pain tolerance, their past, and punished them if he thought they lied. And yet, many of them survived. But they were never the same. Some forgot the events for years. Trauma buried the memories, until a word or a sound would unlock the nightmare again. Others lived in fear that David, or someone like him, would return, because David wasn't always alone. Let's talk about that. See, David Parker Ray didn't act completely solo. Cindy Hendy, his girlfriend, was directly involved. She helped restrain victims. She helped recapture Cynthia Vigil when she first escaped. But she wasn't the only one. Investigators found evidence suggesting Ray had at least two more accomplices. The first was his own daughter, Glenda Jessie Ray. She had lived with David at various points. Witnesses claimed she was present during some of the recorded sessions. At one point, Jessie even introduced a friend to David, and that woman vanished shortly afterward. Glenda was arrested, but there wasn't enough direct evidence to convict her of major crimes. No physical proof. No tape where she was clearly seen harming anyone. She denied involvement. She walked free. The second potential accomplice? A man named Dennis Roy Yancey. He was a drifter, sometimes handyman, often seen around David's property. After David's arrest, Yancey confessed to one thing. He claimed he strangled a woman named Marie Parker at David's command. According to Yancey, David held her in the toy box, tortured her, and when he was done, he told Dennis to kill her. He said he did. Authorities found no body. Still, Yancey was convicted of murder and served time. But again, no closure for Marie Parker's family. No grave. No goodbye. Another life vanished in the desert. Which brings us to the central horror of the toy box killer. There are more victims than names. More screams and tombstones. And more silence and justice. For years after David's death, Elephant Butte lived in his shadow. Tourists came, drawn by macabre curiosity. Locals bristled, ashamed, haunted. The trailer sat on impound property, rotting. Eventually, it was torn down. Most of its contents were incinerated. Some tools were sent to training facilities, but the stories lingered. One officer recalled a training session where they used David's diagrams to teach about behavioral profiling. He said he had to leave the room. He couldn't breathe. The diagrams weren't just sadistic. They were clinical, precise. They showed how to break someone mentally, where pain lasted longest, how to keep someone alive during maximum trauma. David Parker Ray studied anatomy like a surgeon, but not to heal, to harm. Psychologists later diagnosed him posthumously with sadistic personality disorder, narcissism, and antisocial traits. But labels didn't explain the scope of his cruelty. They didn't explain why he made recordings, why he built such a methodical system, why he involved others. Some believe he planned to pass it on, train others, start a kind of secret network. He hinted at it on tape. One recorded monologue included the line, "If you're into this stuff like I am, you'll find it's best to keep a partner. Two can get more done faster and safer. Just make sure they're loyal." It sounded like a warning, or an invitation. To this day, the FBI has not ruled out the possibility that David Parker Ray had more partners, maybe across state lines, maybe even online. Because here's the most disturbing part. He wasn't caught by the police. He wasn't caught by surveillance or tips. He was stopped by a victim. Cynthia Vigil broke free. She saved herself. And in doing so, she saved countless others. Because if she hadn't escaped, if she hadn't run barefoot into that parking lot, David might still be out there today. Still smiling. Still torturing. Still building new toys. Let that settle in your bones tonight. That one man, living in a trailer in a quiet town, created a factory of pain that went unnoticed for decades. No one heard the screams. Or maybe they did, but they didn't listen. The case remains technically open. The FBI still has an active file for David Parker Ray. Why? because some of those tapes are still unsolved. Some voices still need names. And some families still search the desert, looking for someone who vanished without a trace, and wondering, was she in the toy box? Did she scream? Did he record it? As you lay down tonight in your soft bed, behind your locked doors, remember this. Sometimes the worst monsters don't lurk in the shadows. Sometimes they smile, offer you a ride, invite you in. Sometimes they build their own hell and call it a toy box. It was supposed to be just another quiet night in West Texas. The kind of night where the only sound breaking the still air was the occasional cricket, the rustle of dry grass in the breeze, and the hum of a distant pickup truck. But for one man, that night would become the beginning of a mystery that, to this day, remains one of the most chilling, unsolved disappearances in modern history. Brandon Lawson was 26 years old, a hard-working oil field worker living with his girlfriend and their 4 children in San Angelo, Texas. He wasn't perfect. He had his demons like anyone else. But those who knew him described him as a good man, trying to do right by his family. He had recently started a new job in the oil fields and was determined to turn his life around. But on the night of August 8, 2013, something happened. Something so strange and unnerving that it would leave law enforcement, journalists, and amateur internet sleuths alike scratching their heads for over a decade. That evening, Brandon and his longtime girlfriend, Ledessa, got into an argument. Some said it was about drugs. Brandon had struggled with substance use in the past and had recently relapsed. Others say it was just a normal kind of fight that happens between two people carrying the weight of stress, work, and kids. Whatever the reason, Brandon stormed out of the house sometime after 11 p.m. He told Ledessa he was going to his father's home in Crowley, a few hours north. He got into a silver Ford F-150 and drove off into the night, heading up U.S. Route 277. He was upset, maybe even scared. But what no one knew at the time was that Brandon's journey would take a terrifying turn, one that would lead him to the middle of nowhere, alone, in the dark, calling for help from forces no one could see, and speaking words no one could understand. At 12:30 a.m., Brandon called his brother Kyle and told him he had run out of gas on the side of the highway near Bronte, a rural stretch of road surrounded by nothing but flat land and silence. Kyle, concerned, offered to come help. But Brandon said something strange during that call. He told Kyle that he was being chased. He said, 3 expletives are after me. I'm running through the field. Kyle was taken aback. He thought maybe Brandon was hallucinating. Maybe the drugs were messing with his head. But Brandon sounded serious, scared. And when someone like Brandon, who wasn't the kind to scare easily, sounded that afraid, it shook you to your core. Kyle and his girlfriend loaded up some gas cans and headed out to help Brandon. Meanwhile, something else was happening. Something that would forever cement Brandon Lawson's case into the halls of internet mystery and modern folklore. At exactly 12:50 a.m., Brandon made a 911 call to a local dispatcher. That call is infamous now. It's been dissected by audio experts, true crime podcasters, and internet sleuths hundreds of times. The audio is garbled, strange, and full of interference. But one thing is absolutely clear. Brandon believed he was in mortal danger. Yes, I'm in the middle of the field, pulled some guys over, right here going toward Abilene, on both sides. My truck ran out of gas. There's one car here. The guy's chasing me through the woods. Please hurry. The dispatcher asked if he needed an ambulance, to which Brandon replied, No, I need the cops. And then silence. The call dropped. Just like that, a man's voice calling for help was gone. Into the static. Into the blackness of the Texas night. When Kyle arrived near Brandon's truck shortly after 1 a.m., a sheriff's deputy was already on the scene. The truck was abandoned on the side of the road, unlocked. But Brandon wasn't there. His keys and cell phone were missing, and so was he. Kyle kept trying to call Brandon's phone. At one point, Brandon answered, whispering. He said he could see them, Kyle the deputy, but they couldn't see him. He said he was hiding. that he wasn't going to come out because he didn't trust the police. And then his voice disappeared again. More than a decade later, that night still echoes with questions that have no answers. Who was Brandon running from? Why was he so afraid? What did he mean when he said, pulled some guys over? Was it paranoia? Or were there really people after him? Kyle didn't see anyone else on the road that night. No other vehicles. No lights. No signs of life. Just an empty highway and his brother's abandoned truck, sitting like a ghost on the shoulder, its doors wide open like someone had fled in a panic. But the strangeness didn't end there. AS investigators and volunteers combed the area in the following days. There were no signs of a struggle. No blood. No tracks leading away from the road. It was as if Brandon had simply vanished, swallowed up by the night. And still, people kept asking, what did Brandon see out there? And if someone or something was chasing him, where did they go? Brandon's voice had gone silent. After that 911 call, muddied by static, full of half-heard phrases and drenched in panic, the Texas night swallowed him up like he'd never existed. Kyle stood near the truck with the sheriff's deputy, holding a gas can in one hand and his phone in the other, calling again and again. The calls would ring, sometimes go straight to voicemail, and occasionally Brandon would answer, just long enough to whisper something unintelligible or hang up before Kyle could pin him down. At one point, Brandon told Kyle, I'm 10 minutes up the road. Just hurry. Then silence again. The deputy, unaware of the 911 call Brandon had made, chalked up the situation to a domestic argument or a drug-related issue. He didn't find anything suspicious at the truck. No signs of a struggle. No blood. Just an empty Ford F-150 and a growing sense of something off. He didn't know that 30 minutes earlier, Brandon had told a dispatcher that someone was chasing him through a field. And even if he had known, would it have changed anything? Kyle, confused and frustrated, drove up and down the highway looking for his brother. He yelled into the night, shined his flashlight into brush and mesquite trees. But there was nothing, no movement. No voice yelling back, no footprints in the dirt. It was like Brandon had vanished. Ledessa, Brandon's girlfriend, tried calling as well. She had stayed behind a home but hadn't gone to sleep. She was worried when he first left the house. She thought he just needed to cool off. But now it was hours later, and nothing made sense anymore. She texted him, "Where are you?" No reply. As the sun rose over the horizon, casting long shadows across the dry Texas plains, hope started to shift into dread. They searched both sides of the road. They drove miles up and down Route 277. They looked through fields, checked under bridges, into culverts. Nothing. No shoes. No phone. No body. Kyle couldn't shake the feeling that someone had been out there that night. He wasn't sure if it was real or something Brandon imagined, but the way his brother talked, quiet, terrified, convinced, wasn't how a man acts when he's just high. Brandon had used drugs before, but he was functional. He knew what was real. And if Brandon said someone was chasing him, then maybe someone was. The sheriff's department opened a missing person case, but didn't treat it as foul play. They assumed Brandon had wandered off and succumbed to the elements. Coyotes, rattlesnakes, exhaustion. There were plenty of ways to die out in that terrain. But why would a man who could see help standing next to his own truck choose to hide? And hide so well no one could find him? Weeks passed, then months. The case went cold, but the internet picked it up. The 911 call leaked online. Armchair detectives broke down the audio, line by line. They slowed it down, boosted the treble, and filtered out the static. Some heard him say, "They're out to get me." Others claimed he said, "I ran into them," or "I pulled some guys over," which didn't make sense. He wasn't a cop. Theories exploded across Reddit, YouTube, and true crime forums. Maybe Brandon had witnessed something, a drug deal, a murder, something he shouldn't have seen. Maybe he was hallucinating, thinking people were after him when he was really just disoriented in the dark. Maybe he ran into a cartel operation on the back roads. Or maybe, just maybe, something darker, something that didn't leave tracks or evidence had claimed him. People who listened to the call said it didn't sound like a man on drugs. It sounded like a man who knew he was going to die. The words, "There's one car here, the guy's chasing me," hit hard. Especially when you realize no other car was ever found. No sign of another vehicle. And no person ever came forward claiming to have seen Brandon. Search efforts continued over the years, mostly driven by his family and volunteers. They walked those fields over and over again. Cadaver dogs were brought in, helicopters flew overhead, and dozens of amateur sleuths tried to retrace Brandon's final steps using GPS coordinates and cell tower pings. But nothing surfaced. Time moved on. LaDessa moved out of the house. Kyle eventually stopped returning media calls. Brandon's kids grew older without answers, without knowing what happened to their father on that lonely stretch of highway in the middle of the night. Yet the 911 call refused to fade away. In fact, it became more famous. Paranormal investigators got involved. Some claimed the area was cursed, haunted even. There were stories about strange sightings along Route 277, figures in the fields, headlights that vanished when you approached, voices calling out from the grass when no one was there. Of course, that's just talk. Campfire stories to fill the gaps left behind by tragedy. But still, for those who listened to Brandon's voice shaking on that call, it felt like more than just a missing person case. It felt like something had hunted him, and won. By 2021, it had been almost a decade. People still posted theories, still dissected the call, but hope was thin. Then everything changed. On February 4th, 2022, a search team composed of private citizens and drone operators found what appeared to be human remains not far from where Brandon's truck had been abandoned. Alongside them were clothes matching what Brandon was last seen wearing. It wasn't official, but everyone knew. The body had been there the whole time. Out there, in that flat expanse of nothing, just outside the beam of their flashlights, just beyond the edge of each search grid, Brandon had been waiting to be found. It was eerie, it was tragic, and it was quiet, just like the night he disappeared. Law enforcement later confirmed it. The remains were Brandon's, but that only brought more questions. Why wasn't he found earlier? How did he end up in a place that had been searched multiple times? Why was there no sign of injury or foul play? If he died of exposure, why didn't he come out when his brother was calling his name from just a few yards away? Some believe he was too disoriented to realize help was near. Others think fear kept him hidden until it was too late. And then, there are those who believe he was never alone out there to begin with. That maybe in the dark beyond the tree line, someone stood, watching, waiting, and when the voices stopped, they took him. Brandon's case is closed in the eyes of the authorities. But for those who still listen to that 911 call, for those who know the fear in a man's voice when he knows something's not right, the case is far from over, because his last words weren't just a cry for help. They were a warning. As the years passed since Brandon Lawson's disappearance, the search for answers continued to haunt those who had been closest to him. The empty stretch of highway, the desolate Texas wilderness, had swallowed him whole. But now, with the discovery of his remains, a new layer of confusion and horror settled over the case. The location where Brandon's body was discovered was just a short distance from where his truck had been abandoned, almost within reach. It was a place that had been combed through several times during the search, yet somehow the authorities and volunteers had missed it. That chilling fact haunted those who worked tirelessly to bring closure to the case. How could something so obvious remain hidden for so long? And why did it take almost 10 years for the truth to finally surface? But the most unsettling part of the discovery was the condition of his body. There were no signs of obvious injury, no visible wounds, no signs of a struggle, just the remains of a man who had been abandoned in the middle of nowhere, left to fend for himself in the harsh elements of the Texas wilderness. The more they examined the body, the more baffling it became. If Brandon had died of exposure, why hadn't he tried to make his way to safety? Why hadn't he heard the voices calling for him during the search? It didn't make sense. Kyle, Brandon's brother, was devastated by the news. He had spent years looking for him, hoping for a miracle. The possibility that Brandon had been so close all along, just out of reach, tore at his heart. He had called for his brother, pleaded for him to answer, but there had been nothing. The search had been fruitless. Now it was too late. "I can't believe it," Kyle said, his voice trembling with emotion. "I looked for him. We all did. He was right there and we didn't see him." The police investigation that followed seemed almost anticlimactic in comparison to the mounting questions. There was no foul play, no signs of struggle, no apparent cause of death beyond exposure. But the most baffling detail was that Brandon had been so close to safety, so close to being found, yet he had never made it. The searchers had combed that very area multiple times, and yet his body had been lying there, just hidden beneath the brush. How had they missed it? Some investigators theorized that Brandon had simply wandered off in a confused state, succumbing to the elements as he tried to escape from whatever it was that had terrified him. But Kyle and others close to Brandon didn't buy that explanation. They believed that something more sinister had occurred. The theories surrounding Brandon's disappearance only seemed to multiply in the years following the discovery of his remains. Some believed that Brandon had been murdered, that someone had lured him out into the wilderness and then left him to die. The idea that he could have been chased, that someone or something had been after him, lingered in the back of their minds. Could it have been some kind of twisted game? Or was Brandon truly running from something that wasn't just his mind? Others believed that the 911 call was proof of something even darker. The frantic terror in Brandon's voice, the way he kept repeating that he was being chased, sent chills down the spines of anyone who listened to it. There was something in that call that didn't sit right. The static that distorted his voice, the confusion in his words. It all pointed to the idea that Brandon had been trapped in some kind of nightmare, a nightmare he couldn't escape. But was it a nightmare of his own making? Or was there something out there in the wilderness, something that was truly hunting him? The idea that Brandon might have been chased, or worse, hunted by something malevolent, never fully left the minds of those who knew him. As investigators reviewed the 911 call again and again, they couldn't ignore the sense of dread that filled Brandon's words. The fact that his voice had been so filled with panic, that he had been so terrified, was a clear indication that something had pushed him to the brink. But what? There were rumors that the area where Brandon had disappeared was known for strange occurrences. Some locals claimed to have seen strange lights in the sky. Others spoke of eerie whispers in the wind, the kind of whispers that made the hairs on the back of your neck stand on end. But no one could provide any concrete evidence of anything unusual. It was just folklore, local legends. But for some, these stories were more than just tales. They were the pieces of a puzzle that no one wanted to solve. In the years following Brandon's disappearance, more than one investigator came to the conclusion that he had been running from something real. They couldn't explain it, but the 911 call was enough to make them question everything they thought they knew about the case. Had Brandon been pursued by someone? Had he been targeted? Or was it something more supernatural? Something that couldn't be explained by logic or science. The idea that Brandon had been running from something that wasn't just a person, something that couldn't be seen, something that didn't leave tracks, was a theory that became harder to ignore. It was a theory that was as unsettling as it was compelling. Despite the official ruling of death by exposure, Kyle refused to accept that his brother's story had simply ended in the wilderness, forgotten and alone. He couldn't stop thinking about the last moments of Brandon's life. The fear in his voice, the way he had sounded so sure that someone was chasing him, even though no one was ever found. Kyle couldn't shake the feeling that his brother had been the victim of something far more sinister than a tragic accident. The mystery of Brandon Lawson's disappearance and the chilling 911 call that had preceded it would continue to haunt those who had been closest to him. It was a case that defied explanation, a case that was too strange to ignore and too disturbing to forget. And as the years passed, the whispers of the wilderness grew louder. Some believed that Brandon had stumbled upon something that no one was meant to see. Others believed that he had been taken by something beyond comprehension. But the truth, as always, was shrouded in darkness. The last words of Brandon Lawson, those desperate cries for help that echoed through the night, still resonated in the minds of those who had heard them. They were a warning, a chilling reminder of the danger that lurked just beyond the edge of the known world. And no one could say for certain whether the nightmare Brandon had lived through that night was truly over. Some things, it seemed, were never meant to be understood. Some mysteries would never be solved. And the fear of the unknown would continue to linger long after the case had gone cold. But for those who still listened to the 911 call, for those who still wonder what had really happened to Brandon that night, the story was far from over. It had only just begun. Story 4. It was just after midnight on February 3rd, 2006, when KBRX 610 AM, an old independent radio station nestled on the outskirts of Red Cliff, Montana, went silent. Not in the way stations typically fade into static when they lose signal. No, this silence was unnatural. It was sudden, abrupt, like something had physically cut the voice from the airwaves. Those listening to late-night broadcasts that night described it the same way. A pause and a stutter, and then nothing. For years, KBRX was the kind of place that flew under the radar. It wasn't part of any national network, didn't run ads, and didn't care much for politics or popular music. It was known for one thing, the After Dark program. Every Friday night, between midnight and 3 a.m., listeners tuned in to hear stories about UFO sightings, cryptid encounters, and strange voices on cassette tapes. The host was a man named Paul Hartley, a 58-year-old with a warm baritone voice and a dry sense of humor. He'd been doing the show for almost a decade, never missed a single broadcast. Until that night, the last thing anyone heard Paul say on air was, "Okay, caller, that's one hell of a story. Hang tight. We got another one coming up after this quick break. Don't go anywhere." And then came a few seconds of silence. Not the static hiss of a broken transmitter. Not the dead hum of a lost connection. Just silence. At first, listeners thought it was a technical glitch. Maybe Paul had stepped away, spilled coffee on the console again. But minutes passed. 10, 20, half an hour. Nothing but dead air. That's when the station's most loyal night owl, a trucker named Benny who was passing through I-15, called the sheriff's office. When deputies arrived at the station around 2:17 a.m., they found the front door unlocked. The place was dark, except for a soft red glow coming from the on-air sign still flickering inside. The coffee in Paul's mug was still steaming. A half-eaten jelly donut sat beside it. His script was on the table, right where he always left it, halfway through a handwritten list of upcoming callers. But Paul was gone. There was no sign of a struggle. No overturned chairs. No broken glass. Nothing disturbed, aside from a single open cabinet where audio tapes were usually stored. One tape was missing. The only clue left behind was the broadcast console, still running, with a red, live indicator blinking, as if someone was still on the air. The next morning, the Red Cliff Police Department issued a missing persons report. The town buzzed with theories. Some said Paul finally snapped after years of dealing with crazies on the phone. Others claimed he staged his own disappearance. But the most persistent rumor came from a few who had been tuned in during those final moments. They insisted they'd heard something, not Paul, but someone or something else. One caller named Trevor claimed he was on hold during the broadcast and recorded the audio. He handed the cassette over to the sheriff. What it contained was chilling. Paul's voice comes through, casual and steady. "All right, caller, we're going to take a short break here. Hang tight." Then nothing for 6 seconds. followed by a faint whisper, barely audible, almost unintelligible. Then a loud, distorted voice, not Paul's, rasping the words. They're already inside. The tape ends there. No explanation. No return to the show. Just static. The town was shaken. But like all things in Redcliffe, life eventually moved on. The station shut down for a month before a younger host, Mel Price, took over with reruns and safer content. But Paul Hartley was never found. Not a trace. No body, no note, no explanation. 10 years passed. And then someone mailed a package to the Redcliffe Historical Society. No return address. No postage. Just a yellowed envelope containing a single item, a cassette tape marked KBRX. February 3rd, 2006, final broadcast. The director of the Historical Society, Janice Lambert, played it once. Just once. And she refused to speak about what she heard. She handed it to police, who logged into evidence but kept it quiet, until one day that evidence file, just like Paul Hartley, disappeared. But that's not where the story ends. Because 2 weeks ago, a YouTube video began circulating online. A channel called Shortwave Echoes posted a 10-minute clip titled Lost Radio Transmission, Real or Hoax? It was a cleaned-up version of the same audio. And this time, you could hear it clearly. Paul welcoming the next caller, the switch to dead air, then whispers. At the 6-minute mark, Paul says shakily, "Is someone there? Hello? How'd you get in here?" Then the unmistakable sound of footsteps, dragging, slow, followed by a voice, deep, layered, and not human, repeating, "Signal found." Door opened. The final sound is Paul screaming, muffled, like a mic being crushed under pressure. And then, nothing. Nobody knows who uploaded the audio. The account has since vanished, but copies still float around. Some claim they hear different things each time they play it. Some say listening too long causes electronics in the room to glitch. Lights flicker. Radios buzz with white noise, even when unplugged. And some people swear they've heard that same voice whispering from their car stereo while driving through Montana late at night. There's one more detail the police never released, but an ex-detective anonymously posted it to a forum years later. He said the forensic team dusted the studio for prints and found a set they couldn't identify. Not just human, some were smaller, narrower, as if the skin had been stretched tight with too many joints. They found smears of something oily and black near the microphone, almost like ink, but it wouldn't dry. It pulsed when they touched it. The ex-detective said he quit the force after that night, not because of what they found, but because of what they heard. The cassette, it played once in the evidence room. Everyone present heard the voice at the end whisper their own name, then silence. And when they tried to play again, the tape had melted inside the reel. One officer started bleeding from his ears an hour later. Another had a seizure. A third walked out of the station and was never seen again. They say the tape wasn't just a recording. It was a door. And Paul Hartley wasn't the only one it opened for. To this day, if you drive along Route 6 just north of Redcliffe, you might see the old KBRX sign still rusting above a shuttered building. The windows are boarded up and the tower's long gone. But locals warn travelers not to stop there. Not at night, because some claim if you tune to 6:10 a.m. around 3:17 a.m., you can still hear him. Paul's voice distant, crackling, echoing like it's trapped inside the static, begging for help, saying they're still inside, and that now they're listening. The town of Redcliffe never fully recovered from what happened at KBRX. Theories came and went like gusts of wind across the Montana plains, but none could explain what truly happened that February night. Paul Hartley's name became legend, whispered by locals in dive bars and among truckers on late-night CB chatter. He was a ghost in the tower, the missing voice on frequency that still, sometimes, seemed to hum with life when it shouldn't. 15 years passed. In late September of 2021, a college student named Eric Langford drove into Redcliffe. He was a senior at Montana State, working on his final project for a media studies class, a podcast about the history of American radio and unsolved mysteries tied to broadcast signals. He'd heard of the KBRX case through an obscure Reddit thread and decided to build his entire project around it. To him, it was just another strange story in a long list of audio oddities. He didn't believe in ghosts or alien frequencies. He believed in signal bleed, faulty wiring, suggestible minds. Eric had no idea what he was walking into. He rented a room at a roadside motel and began his research. The locals were wary, tight-lipped and suspicious of outsiders. But money loosened tongues, and after a few days, he gathered enough old clippings, interviews, and archive footage to piece together the basics. But it was one conversation that changed everything. At a bar called the Halfway Tap, an older man with pale, watery eyes approached him. He didn't introduce himself, just sat down across from Eric and whispered, "You're looking for the tape, aren't you?" Eric, startled, nodded slowly. "Yeah, for research. I've heard there was a copy, maybe a bootleg floating around." The man leaned in closer. "You don't want to hear it. You think you do. You think it's just noise. But it's not. It answers back." Eric tried to press him for more, but the man stood up, dropped a matchbook onto the table, and walked out. The matchbook had a single phrase scrawled inside, "Storage B, Murphy Road." The next morning, Eric followed the lead. Murphy Road was a dirt path winding off the main highway, barely visible through the overgrown brush. At the end stood a set of rusted-out storage units, most of them padlocked or caved in, but one, B17, had its door slightly ajar. Inside, the air was stale, heavy with the scent of mold and motor oil. Old furniture, broken radios, and boxes of cassette tapes littered the unit. And in the far corner, inside a metal ammo box, Eric found it, a black tape labeled KBRX Final. He stared at it for a long time before slipping it into his backpack. That night, Eric borrowed a player from the motel clerk and set up his recording equipment. He planned to digitize the tape for analysis, maybe even feature clips on his podcast. He didn't expect it to actually work. But when he pressed play, the tape spun smoothly. It began with Paul's familiar voice. Calm, collected, midnight again. You know the number. Folks, let's see what the shadows have for us tonight. A few minutes of ordinary banter, then a shift. Paul pauses mid-sentence. What's that sound? There's a distortion, a warping in the audio, like something else is bleeding in. A faint whisper. Then Paul again. No, wait. That's not. Who's there? Silence. Then the voice returns. Low, rumbling, almost mechanical, yet organic. A harmony of tones stacked atop each other, vibrating unnaturally. Signal found. Door opened. Anchor secured. Eric flinched, staring at the player. This wasn't a prank. This wasn't human. The tape continued. Paul screams. Not a theatrical cry. Real panic terror. Then a sound, like fabric tearing underwater, followed by Paul whispering, barely audible, "It's inside me." The audio warped again. The hiss of static became a voice. Not Paul, not the entity. It was Eric's, his own voice. On the tape, he recoiled, heart pounding. The tape ended. Eric sat frozen in place, staring at the player. Then, as if summoned, the motel room's lamp flickered. The television turned on by itself, displaying only static. His laptop, unplugged, lit up, and the waveform display on his recording software began to shift. A voice formed from the squiggles. No microphone input, no signal, just a voice forming on screen. Now you're the receiver. The air in the room thickened. The walls seemed to vibrate. And then silence. Eric blacked out. When he came to, it was morning. The player was gone. So was the tape. But his laptop still worked. And when he checked the audio files, the recording was there, though slightly different. The voice at the end was missing, replaced by another. A woman's voice. Soft, familiar, his mother's. Eric, don't listen again. But Eric's mother had died when he was 12. He returned to campus shaken. He submitted a cleaned-up version of the broadcast for his class project, omitting the final section. He didn't want questions. He didn't want to explain the blackout or the missing hours. But he couldn't leave it alone. Late one night, he went back through the raw recording, slowed it down, layered the audio, tried to reverse the interference. And he found something. Hidden beneath the static were coordinates, latitude, longitude, a point in the woods just outside Redcliffe, near the old station tower. Against all sense, Eric returned. He couldn't sleep, couldn't think. His dreams were warped, filled with looping voices and broken frequencies. He had to know. He arrived just after sunset. The forest was quiet, unnaturally so. The air buzzed with the pressure he felt in his teeth. As he neared the coordinates, he saw it, the tower, the same one that had been dismantled 15 years ago. Standing tall, fully restored, lights blinking at the top. But it wasn't real. It flickered like a hologram, struggling to maintain form. And at its base a door, wooden, out of place. Eric approached it, every part of his body screaming to run. But the door opened on its own, and inside, darkness. But he stepped through. His phone, his recorder, all electronics failed instantly. He felt a rush of wind, then nothing, just silence. And somewhere in that silence, the echo of Paul Hartley's voice, repeating over and over, signal found, door opened, anchor secured. Eric Langford was never seen again. 3 weeks later, a podcaster named Simon Cruz received an anonymous email with an attachment, a high-quality MP3 labeled Eric_final.wave. Simon thought it was spam until he played it. It started with Eric narrating his journey, his research, the discovery of the tape. It detailed every step up until the tower. Then came the final minute. Not Eric's voice, not Paul's, but something else. We are through. You heard us. Now others will. The MP3 corrupted mid-play. Simon unplugged everything and called the police. But by the time they traced the IP address that sent the file, it led back to KBRX. And the station had no internet, no power, and no building. Just the empty dirt lot where it once stood. Only one item remained on that property. A small, rusted sign buried under brush, with the words barely legible, now broadcasting beyond. The tape didn't end with Eric Langford's disappearance. In fact, it may not have even started there. Following the last known recording sent to podcaster Simon Cruz, the file began to spread in quiet, almost calculated ways. It showed up on peer-to-peer file sharing sites, tucked inside folders with names like weather_it_logs and Vegas_ backups. Users reported corrupted downloads, strange audio glitches, and most disturbingly, subtle overlays of their own voices layered into the playback, saying things they claimed they'd never recorded. By the end of that year, the file had been renamed dozens of times, but the most common version people stumbled upon bore one simple title. The wave. Simon Cruz, despite his better judgment, couldn't stop thinking about Eric. He pulled back from public podcasting, locked himself away, and started digging into old broadcast records. He acquired a decade's worth of FCC logs, looking for abnormalities. He didn't expect to find anything, but in the spring of 2022, he did. The call sign KBRX had reappeared, not in Montana, but in rural Idaho, a ghost station, low frequency, unlicensed, but traceable. Broadcasting for only 1 hour each night, between 1:11 a.m. and 2:11 a.m. Same format, paranormal open lines. Same slogan, midnight belongs to the unheard. Simon ordered a shortwave receiver and tuned in, What he heard chilled him. It was Paul Hartley's voice. Not a recording, new, aging, different. You've reached the final hour. You know the number. You've always known the number. Simon recorded every transmission. Each night, Paul would recount stories, some familiar, some utterly alien. He spoke of doors behind wallpaper, of mirrors that reflected other realities, of numbers that hummed in your bones. And occasionally, he'd call out names of listeners, including Eric Langford, including Simon Cruz. Then, on the seventh night, something changed. There was a long stretch of silence. Then a hiss. Then Paul's voice again, but not live. Old, warped, taken from the last tape. Signal found. Door opened. Anchor secured. Then came something new. A child's voice, whispering, "We are signal-born. We ride the static. You invited us." Simon unplugged the radio and burned the tapes. But it didn't matter, because the voices didn't need antennas anymore. They had made a leap from frequency to memory. Simon began hearing echoes even in silence, static in his shower drain, humming in the pipes, the whispering of call signs in his dreams. Then he began seeing the tower, not outside, inside, behind his closet, flickering in the corner of his vision, a thin spire of impossible metal, with blinking lights that pulse in sync with heartbeat. He posted a final message online. The broadcast is a virus. It doesn't want listeners. It wants repeaters. Then he disappeared. All that was found in his apartment was a spiral-bound notebook, its final page reading, "The signal isn't trying to reach us. We're inside it." Meanwhile, in Redcliffe, the town began to change. At first, small things. Old radios turning on by themselves. Static bursts over the school's intercom system. People reporting dreams of man with no face, holding a microphone made of bone. Then people started going missing. Teens dared each other to visit the old lot where the KBRX station once stood. Urban legends grew like mold. Some claimed the building had returned, but only at midnight, and only if you tuned to 1420 a.m. Police dismissed it all until one officer responded to a noise complaint and was never seen again. His last dispatch? "I see it. I see the tower. There's someone waving." No one believed it until local authorities set up a trail cam on the site. The next morning, the footage was blank, except for the audio. 13 seconds of a child humming. And then, softly, "Midnight belongs to us now." Some say the signal has evolved. It's no longer bound by radio waves or wires. It travels through vibrations and sound itself, through songs, through white noise, through the frequencies of your own voice. Whispers beneath podcasts, echoes behind laughter. Some listeners on the Mr. DarXnights channel even claim they've heard it. Faint, just beneath the outro music, a voice whispering, "You're a receiver now." And if you hear it, you've already been marked, because the signal isn't seeking an audience anymore. It's building one voice at a time, one dream at a time. And when it's ready, when enough of us are tuned in, it won't need towers anymore. It will broadcast through us, forever, until the last voice fades. And even then, the static will hum, waiting, ready to whisper again. They're already inside. Story 5. In the vast expanse of the Arizona desert, where the sun scorches the earth by day and the stars illuminate the sky by night, there stood a modest, weathered establishment known as the Sunset Inn, located off a desolate stretch of highway. It was the kind of place that travelers stumbled upon when fatigue set in and the next town was too far to reach. The Sunset Inn boasted a faded neon sign that flickered intermittently, casting an eerie glow over the gravel parking lot. Its exterior was a blend of peeling paint and sun-bleached wood, with a row of doors leading to individual rooms. Among these, Room 103 held a sinister reputation, whispered among locals and long-haul truckers alike. Over the span of 8 years, a disturbing pattern emerged. Guests who checked into Room 103 often vanished without a trace. Their vehicles remained parked outside, personal belongings untouched, but the individuals themselves were never seen again. The motel's owner, a reclusive man named Harold Granger, claimed that room 103 had been closed for renovations during those years, attributing any discrepancies to clerical errors. However, the motel's check-in records told a different story. They indicated that room 103 had been occupied numerous times during the period in question. When pressed, Granger insisted that the records were outdated or incorrect, maintaining that the room was uninhabitable due to ongoing repairs. The local authorities, initially dismissive, began to take notice as the list of missing persons grew. Each case shared a common thread. The last known location of the individual was the Sunset Inn, specifically room 103. Despite this, investigations yielded no concrete evidence, and with no signs of foul play, the cases remained unsolved. It wasn't until a determined detective named Elena Martinez took over the investigation that progress was made. Driven by a personal connection, her cousin had disappeared after staying at the Sunset Inn. Elena was relentless in her pursuit of the truth. Elena began by interviewing former employees and guests, piecing together a timeline of events. She discovered that Granger had a habit of hiring transient workers, individuals with no ties to the community who would disappear as quickly as they arrived. Many of these workers were assigned to maintenance tasks, often centered around room 103. One former housekeeper, a woman named Linda, recounted a chilling experience. She claimed that while cleaning room 103, she felt an overwhelming sense of dread, as if she were being watched. Upon inspecting the room, she discovered a small peephole hidden behind a painting on the adjacent wall. The peephole led to a narrow corridor that connected to a hidden observation room, complete with surveillance equipment. Armed with this information, Elena obtained a warrant to search the premises. The investigation revealed a concealed trapdoor beneath the bed in room 103, leading to an underground crawl space. Inside, authorities found a chilling collection of personal items, wallets, shoes, clothing, and even bloodstained luggage. The crawl space also contained a makeshift living area, suggesting that someone had been residing there, observing guests through the peephole. Confronted with the evidence, Granger confessed to his crimes. He admitted to luring guests into room 103, drugging them, and then disposing of their bodies in the desert. He had been operating under the radar for years, exploiting the motel's remote location and the transient nature of his clientele. The discovery sent shockwaves through the community, and the Sunset Inn was permanently closed. The property was eventually demolished, leaving behind only the memories of the horrors that had occurred within its walls. Yet, even after its destruction, rumors persisted. Travelers claimed to see the flickering neon sign of the Sunset Inn in the distance, only for it to vanish upon approach. Some reported hearing whispers in the wind, as if the souls of the lost were still trapped, seeking justice. When the Sunset Inn was finally torn down, most believed the nightmare had ended. The dusty crawl space was filled with concrete, the surveillance equipment confiscated, and the peephole wall dismantled piece by piece. But what couldn't be removed was the stain it left on the community of Arroyo Creek. People still avoided that stretch of desert, still lowered their voices when they mentioned room 103, and still locked their doors a little tighter when the wind howled late at night. Detective Elena Martinez didn't sleep much anymore. She had closed the case, yes, but every time she closed her eyes, she didn't see Harold Granger's face in court. She saw the faces of the missing, lined up in neat little rows in her mind, silent, accusing. Faces like her cousin Marco, who had only planned to stop for gas and a quick nap, but was never seen again. Harold's confession had mentioned only 7 victims, but the evidence hinted at far more. Elena suspected he hadn't told them everything, and one thing haunted her above all else. He claimed he wasn't the only one watching. In his interviews, Harold spoke of the man in the crawl space. At first, authorities dismissed it as a deflection tactic or a sign of deteriorating mental health. He described this man as someone who lived beneath the floorboards, whispering instructions late at night. Elena had chalked it up to psychosis until one final piece of evidence surfaced. A tape reel found buried behind the motel office, inside a metal canister labeled Only 103. It was old-school magnetic tape, the kind used in antique recorders from the 1960s. The audio department at the station dusted off a machine just to play it. What came through the speakers didn't sound like Harold. The voice was raspier, slower. It spoke in cryptic riddles, repeating the phrase, "They sleep above, they all sleep above." Then silence, then a dragging noise, then a scream. The audio had been dated back at least 15 years, well before Harold ever bought the motel. Elena felt something twist in her gut. She went back to the site of the demolished motel. The land had been sold to a private developer planning to build a gas station and a mini-mart, but construction had stalled. The foreman told her, nervously, that every time they broke ground near where room 103 once stood, their equipment would fail. Power generators died without cause, and more than once, workers reported hearing crying beneath the soil. Elena got access to property again and, against her better judgment, came alone one night just after dusk. She parked her car by the chain-link fence surrounding the site and climbed over. The desert air was bone dry, but the breeze was bitterly cold. She found the concrete slab poured over the crawl space. A few chunks of rebar stuck out, bent at strange angles, almost as if they tried to twist themselves out of the ground. She sat down beside it and closed her eyes, listening. At first, there was nothing but wind, but then a soft sound, a tap, then another, then a slow, rhythmic scratching, like nails against the underside of a wooden floor. She shot to her feet, heart hammering. Her flashlight danced across the slab, revealing nothing, but she couldn't deny what she'd heard. She marked the location and returned the next day with a ground-penetrating radar specialist from a neighboring precinct. What they discovered chilled them both. Below the concrete was not one crawl space, but a network of connected chambers, hand-dug tunnels spiderwebbing outward for hundreds of feet. Inside them, dozens of cavities, some no bigger than a coffin. No one had ever bothered to look that deep. Excavation began. They found skeletal remains in 14 of the chambers. Most had no identification. Some had old motel key cards in their pockets. All had died from blunt force trauma or asphyxiation. Harold couldn't have done this alone. Not without someone noticing the extensive tunneling. Not without help. Elena reopened the investigation. But Harold was no longer talking. He had died in prison just days before the excavation, hung in his cell with a bedsheet tied to a heating vent. His body was found with a look of terror frozen on his face, as if he had seen something no one else could. The autopsy showed deep scratch marks on his legs. It didn't end there. The forensic team discovered something unusual in the last tunnel chamber. A wooden rocking chair, an old tape recorder, and a journal. The journal wasn't Harold's. It was dated 1952 and belonged to a man named Samuel Orwin, the original owner of the Sunset Inn, long presumed dead. His final entries were erratic, unstable, filled with claims of voices coming from under the floor at night. One entry read, "They live under room 103. They've always lived there. I only fed them. I didn't make them." The name Samuel Orwin was unfamiliar, but Elena cross-referenced historical property records and confirmed it. He had built the motel by hand, decades before Harold ever bought it, and Orwin had vanished in 1956 without a trace. The audio logs found near the chair were even more disturbing. They feature recordings of people sobbing, whispering, and in some cases, begging. One tape, labeled Guest 14, included what sounded like a conversation between two voices, one frantic, one cold and inhuman. The last few seconds of the tape were static, followed by the sound of a door slowly creaking open. Elena started to believe this place was never a motel. It was something else, a feeding ground, a trap disguised as shelter. She took a leave of absence from the force, officially citing burnout. But in truth, she couldn't stop herself. She needed to know what room 103 really was. She pored over maps, old blueprints, local legends. The area had long been feared by indigenous tribes, who referred to that patch of land as the Hollow Mouth. Folklore spoke of shadow dwellers, beings that mimicked voices, drew travelers in, and fed on memory and identity. People who entered were never truly gone. They were absorbed. Late one night, Elena received a voicemail from a block number. It was her cousin Marco's voice. "El, I think I'm under the floor. I see you. Please help me." The call lasted 20 seconds. When traced, it pinged from the exact location where room 103 used to be. But no phone was ever found. The voicemail didn't just haunt Elena Martinez. It consumed her. Hearing Marco's voice, warped and distant, was like dragging open an old wound she'd never allowed to heal. She played it over and over again, dissecting every breath, every syllable, trying to hear something more behind the panic. She sent it to audio specialists, law enforcement techs, even a retired FBI profiler. They all gave the same answer. The voice matched her cousin's records exactly. There were no signs of splicing or synthetic manipulation. It wasn't a trick or a hoax. It was Marco. But that raised a darker question. Marco had been missing for nearly 7 years, and the crawl space had been filled with remains. Some of them, however, had no match in any database. Some were never identified. Elena had the gnawing suspicion that Marco wasn't among the dead because he wasn't exactly dead, not in the way she understood it. Whatever existed beneath room 103 had been drawing people in long before Harold Granger ever set foot on the property. And Harold's death had only added another disturbing clue: scratch marks on the inside of his own cell door. Just like the ones found under the motel beds. Just like the ones found on the crawlspace walls. There was something more to this. Something buried too deep for the courts or newspapers to ever see. So, Elena went rogue. She resigned from the department, packed her files, bought a camper van, and returned to Arroyo Creek for good. Everyone in town assumed she'd finally snapped. Most had moved on, eager to forget what happened. The sunset in sight had been left untouched for over a year now. The land had gone back up for sale. No one wanted it, but Elena did. She camped on the edge of the property. At night, she left out recorders and motion sensors. Strange readings returned every night. High EMF spikes, distorted audio, footsteps pacing above ground where no one stood. Once, she captured a voice, cracked and thin, whispering her name through the static. That's when she made a decision. One she knew could cost her everything. She was going back in. There were still unsearched tunnels, chambers the excavation teams had never reached before they were shut down. Elena had kept the old maps, copied from the construction blueprints of the original inn. If she could find another access point, maybe, just maybe, she could reach where Marco had been calling from. She waited for the coldest night in January. The wind would keep people indoors, and the frost would cover her tracks. Just after midnight, she donned her old tactical gear and crept past the rusted construction fences. The main slab covering room 103 had cracked in the last storm. Frost heaved, they'd said, but Elena believed something underneath had pushed upward. She dug, slowly, carefully, beneath the concrete edge. She found it, a rusted service hatch half buried in sand and ash. The metal groaned as she forced it open, revealing a narrow shaft descending into pure black. The air that rushed up was thick, stale and wet, like breath exhaled from lungs that hadn't inhaled in decades. She climbed down. Her boots hit dirt. The flashlight beam cut through the dark, revealing the walls of the tunnel, wooden slats and cobwebs, narrow enough to brush both her shoulders. The floor was lined with carpet remnants, as if someone had tried to make it feel more like a home. The tunnel stretched forward into silence. Elena moved slowly. She passed old motel keys nailed into the wall, one for each missing guest. Beneath each key was a photograph faded and water-stained. Some she recognized, others she didn't. Some were children. Her breath hitched. The corridor turned sharply left, leading to a larger chamber. Inside were dozens of personal items, watches, handbag, crumpled clothes, and scraps of IDs. This was where the victim's belongings had been dumped, like trophies. At the far end of the chamber was a door, not a crawlspace door, a real one, wooden, heavy, numbered 103. She froze. She wasn't sure how it was possible, but the room had been recreated underground, furniture and all, bed, lamp, nightstand, even a window frame, though it opened in nothing but dirt. Elena stepped inside, heart pounding. It looked exactly like the real room once had, before the demolition. She stepped forward, surveying every inch. On the wall across from the bed was a full-length mirror. Her reflection stared back, but something was off. Her reflection's lips moved, though she hadn't spoken. Then it smiled. The mirror fogged slightly, as if from someone breathing behind it. Elena backed away. The room grew colder. The bulb in the lamp flickered, then burst. In the pitch black, she heard it, the same scratching she'd heard a year ago at the site. Closer now. Then a voice. Elena. It was Marco. She spun toward the mirror, now fogged completely. A shape pressed against the other side. Hands, face, eyes pleading. Elena, help me. I'm still here. She ran to the mirror, tried to touch it, but it was solid, cold. The figure on the other side began to fade, like smoke curling away into shadow. Behind her, the door slammed shut, then silence, until another voice spoke from the ceiling. You should not have come alone. Elena turned just in time to see the trapdoor in the ceiling open, revealing an eye, wide, unblinking, impossibly large. Then everything went black. 3 days later, local police found her van abandoned by the fence. The engine was still warm. Her files were inside. The recorder was running. The last thing it captured was her whispering, "He's not alone down here. They never were." Then static. Then silence. The authorities didn't reopen the case. They chalked it up to personal trauma, stress-related breakdown. But the land was officially declared condemned. Concrete was poured across the entire area. Motion-activated floodlights were installed. Still, people say they see figures standing just beyond the fence at night, watching, waiting. A new motel was built 15 miles west. Room numbers start at 104. There is no room 103, but sometimes travelers report booking a room that doesn't show on the floor plan. A room tucked at the end of the hall with no staff access. A room that disappears in the morning. A room with a mirror that doesn't reflect quite right. Mr. DarXnights would like to remind you, next time you check into a roadside motel, pay close attention to your room number. If it's 103, leave. Quickly, because some rooms never let you check out, and some guests never truly leave. If you enjoyed tonight's chilling tale, don't forget to hit that like button, share with your friends, and subscribe for more dark stories. Because here, we're always just getting started. The video fades to black with a final haunting note as the screen shows the words. Stay tuned for the next nightmare.
Thank you.